Mr. President, it was about 5 or 6 weeks ago that I accepted an invitation and an opportunity to visit Caracas, Venezuela. I'd never been to that country before and spent 4 days. Turns out that not many members of Congress go to this country, and very few are given permission if they ask. But for some reason, I was given permission and went down there to meet with the leaders of their government and to take stock of what was happening in Venezuela. Sadly, I have to report that Venezuela, that proud nation, is teetering on collapse. I met with President Maduro, members of his government, opposition leaders, civic and humanitarian leaders, medical experts, victims of the regime's political repression, and an American who is currently jailed on political charges in Caracas. What I found there and recounted on the floor a few weeks ago was a heartbreaking set of overlapping crises: humanitarian, economic, and political. And while these three inexcusable crises the government's making continue, the people of this poor nation are increasingly suffering and leaving in desperation. It is one of the most desperate situations I've ever seen in a country not in the midst of a war. In my discussion with President Maduro, I urged him to help get his country out of the international isolation they currently face and put an end to the human suffering by starting with a clean election. Well, last Sunday, there was an election. It was a farce. I asked him to release political opponents so that they could run for office. I asked him to authorize parties to field candidates. I asked him to create enough time in the election cycle so there could be a real campaign. And I told him if he didn't and went through with his election campaign, it would not be a credible result. We know that the Maduro regime was using food among their starving people to manipulate votes. They had, unfortunately, no credible election monitors before or during the vote. And of course, they rushed the election to get the result they were looking for. I recently joined with Senator Menendez in New Jersey. We said quite simply that Maduro should have the courage to have an open election, a democratic process. The great hero of Venezuela, as we arrived and noticed at the airport, was Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez won his first election in a democratic manner. And I urge that President Maduro now do the same. I also was direct in saying to him that he had to release the American Josh Holt, who's being held in prison in Caracas on political charges. Why is he being held? Because he traveled to Venezuela to be with and to marry the woman he loved and to bring her and her 2 daughters back to his home state of Utah. He crossed with the Maduro regime in that process. They arrested him on charges that are outrageous, and they're holding him now for almost 2 years without a meaningful trial or a resolution of the dispute. As the events of the last few weeks have shown, the obvious path forward for Venezuela has been rejected by the Maduro regime. Instead, they went ahead with last Sunday's widely discredited election in which his regime jailed or disqualified any meaningful opponent. It was a farce. It will only result in further isolation and suffering of the Venezuelan people. And I know that President Maduro is blaming Yankee imperialists for the problems his country faces or the opposition to his leadership. He need only look to neighboring nations in Central and South America to see they also reject what he has done politically. Despite stirring video pleas from prison in which Josh Holt, the American, is being held, Maduro's regime wouldn't even meet with our top diplomat in Caracas. Todd Robinson is a charge d'affaires representing the United States, since we're not allowed to have an ambassador in that country. He went to the foreign ministry on behalf of Josh Holt when he heard about the prison rioting and the dangers to this American prisoner who's being held on political charges. Obviously, he got under the skin of President Maduro, who's now expelled him. The The Trump administration has been unequivocal in claiming the Venezuelan election was a sham and also claiming new economic sanctions to put pressure on the leaders in the Venezuelan government to change. As I told President Maduro and members of his government, both parties in America may have our squabbles and differences, but when it comes to Venezuela, we stand together. Republicans and Democrats agree that things need to change dramatically in Venezuela if they want to enter the family of civilized nations around the world. And President Maduro has responded, not by reaching out to the opposition, not by showing any true reform, but in rejecting every overture. He refuses to release Josh Holt and his Venezuelan wife and daughter, to allow them to come to the United States. He still keeps Leopoldo Lopez, a political leader in Venezuela, under house arrest. I spoke to Mr. Lopez by phone, met personally with his wife. It is shameful what they are doing to him. By restoring the power of the legitimate National Assembly, President Maduro would show that he's willing to move toward the Constitution which guided his country, but he refuses. He refuses to start a meaningful dialogue with the Lima Group, other nations in the region that want to work with him toward moving Venezuela to a better day. He refuses to work with neighbors and humanitarian groups who truly want to address the suffering in that country. It wasn't until the public health briefing, which I had in Venezuela, and a personal visit to a local hospital, that it really hit me, and hit me hard, how bad things are. This is a country, one of the few on earth not at war, that is currently facing epidemics of measles, diphtheria, and malaria. When you go to Caracas, city hospitals, not remote or rural hospitals, but city hospitals, and ask them what they need, they tell you vaccines, antibiotics, cancer drugs, the basics. They don't have them in that country. And the people, you can just see on the streets of Caracas, are starving. They're starving. They don't have enough food to eat in that country. The inflation is so out of control that people stand in line an hour a day to get the maximum withdrawal on their credit card in hard currency, because that withdrawal is worth the 60 cents that they need for a round-trip bus fare to the place of work. At 11 o'clock at night in the darkness, you'll see people standing by ATM machines to withdraw a wad of currency worth 60 cents so they can board the bus the next morning. This expulsion of our charge d'affaires, Todd Robinson, was really disgraceful. He was accused of conspiring against the Venezuelan government, and what did he do? He stood up for the American prisoner, Josh Holt. That's all. Todd Robinson is one of the nation's highly respected diplomats who carries the rank of ambassador and has served in some of the most challenging countries around the world with distinction. I spoke to him on the phone yesterday. He's disappointed. He knows there's much work to be done in Venezuela to protect innocent people and to make sure that the Americans have a strong presence to protect them as well. And now he's being expelled. I watched him during the visit to Caracas a few weeks ago try to establish a dialogue with the Maduro regime. It's next to impossible. A dialogue requires someone on the other side who's listening and responding in good faith. That was not the case. When I spoke to him, our charge d'affaires, Mr. Robinson, was packing up and helping the embassy staff prepare for his departure. He'll be back in Washington area over the weekend. I thanked him for his service in Venezuela and his team that continues to soldier on under some of the most difficult circumstances in the world. Until the Maduro regime stops dismantling their country's democracy and starts to address the true humanitarian crisis which exists in their country, I will continue to support U.S. and regional measures to put pressure on the Maduro regime to change. I know of no other way to do this that will bring more suffering and death to the innocent people of Venezuela. This once great nation will not be great again until its leadership understands that the current approach, denying the democracy, denying the electoral process, refusing to have an open dialogue with democratic nations around the world, is only sinking them further into the abyss.